Forward. Why the Mayflower Mattered, excerpt from a declassified PNFC Commission analysis released under the Continuity Review Act, year 2042. There is a persistent misconception in early interplanetary history that the crisis surrounding the Mayflower marked the moment space became political. This is incorrect. Space was political long before the Mayflower ever flew. What changed during the period now referred to as the Access Crisis was not the presence of politics, but the visibility of power. For decades, access beyond Earth's atmosphere had been framed as a technical challenge, one of engineering, funding, and coordination. The institutions that governed orbital and interplanetary movement relied heavily on this framing. It allowed authority to remain diffused, responsibility to remain abstract, and accountability to remain optional. The Mayflower did not introduce coercion into space. It exposed it. By the time the first permanent Martian settlements were declared viable, humanity had already entered an era defined less by exploration and more by management. Launch windows, docking permissions, orbital traffic slots, and cargo prioritization had quietly replaced flags and treaties as the instruments through which influence was exercised. These mechanisms were largely invisible to the public and poorly understood even by the institutions that relied upon them. They were designed for efficiency, not resilience, coordination, not conflict. The Planetary Naval Fleet Command, PNFC, was founded to address this imbalance. Its charter emphasized access, continuity, and non-militarization. It was intentionally civilian in structure and deliberately ambiguous in authority. That ambiguity was not an oversight. It was a political compromise, one that allowed multiple stakeholders to project their own assumptions onto a single framework. As long as space access remained stable, those assumptions went unchallenged. The Mayflower entered service during this period of assumed stability. It was neither the largest ship ever constructed nor the most technologically advanced. Its significance lay elsewhere. It was the first vessel designed explicitly around the premise that interplanetary movement was no longer exceptional. Colonists, technicians, medical evacuees, and returnees moved through its corridors not as pioneers, but as participants in a system that expected continuity. That expectation proved fragile. When access began to narrow first through regional restrictions, then through emergency advisories, and finally through formalized denial, the infrastructure designed to remain invisible was forced into the open. The mechanisms that once optimized traffic now determined survival. Schedules became permissions. Delays became leverage. Safety protocols became policy instruments. The Mayflower Protocol, drafted years earlier in response to perceived vulnerabilities, formalized this shift. Contrary to popular narratives, the protocol was not created in haste, nor was it the product of panic. It was written deliberately, reviewed extensively, and ratified with full awareness of its implications. Its purpose was not merely to respond to crisis, but to preserve authority during uncertainty. What followed has been variously described as failure, overreach, inevitability, or betrayal. Subsequent analyses have focused heavily on individual decisions, intelligence assessments, and operational outcomes. These factors matter, but they are insufficient. The deeper lesson of the Mayflower lies not in what was done, but in what was already possible. The events chronicled in this volume are not presented as a morality play. They represent a case study in how systems behave under strain, how institutions designed to guarantee access can, without contradiction, become instruments of exclusion. The Mayflower mattered because it occupied the intersection of civilian trust and administrative power. It mattered because it was assumed to be neutral. What this record demonstrates, often uncomfortably, is that space did not become militarized through force of arms, but through the quiet normalization of authority. The corridor did not close with an announcement, but with a memo. The transition from coordination to control occurred incrementally, each step justified by necessity, each delay framed as precaution. In the years since, many of the structures described here have been revised, renamed, or dismantled. Others persist, largely unchanged. The debate over access continues, often with the benefit of hindsight and the absence of consequence. This foreword is included not to resolve that debate, but to contextualize it. The chapters that follow reconstruct a period in which movement itself became contested terrain, and in which the distinction between civilian and strategic space collapsed, not through declaration, but through practice. The Mayflower did not cause that collapse. It revealed it. Prologue. Orbital silence. Mars filled the lower hemisphere of the viewport, its curvature vast and unbroken, of a rust-colored arc suspended against the dark. From orbit, the planet appeared stable, unchanging, patient, indifferent to the systems that circled it. The illusion had been useful. It had allowed planners and administrators to believe that presence implied control. Inside the Mars Orbital Authority complex, the morning shift began without incident. Power distribution cycled through routine diagnostics. Docking schedules updated automatically, reconciling minor delays across surface ports and orbital platforms. Communications traffic flowed steadily, compressed and prioritized through channels that had not changed in years. The Authority had been designed to manage continuity, not crisis. Its greatest strength was that it rarely required attention. At 6:14 local station time, a logistics confirmation request from settlement Helios queued without response. The system flagged the delay, assigned it low priority, and moved on. A maintenance drone failed to report its return to bay. The anomaly registered briefly before being overridden by a higher volume data transfer originating from the surface. No alarm sounded. No human operator was alerted. The Authority's architecture assumed failure would be incremental, localized, and recoverable. At 6:19, a communications relay reported intermittent packet loss. Error correction routines compensated automatically. The loss fell within acceptable margins. The relay remained online. A junior coordinator noticed the discrepancy and tagged it for review. The review was scheduled for later. From the command ring, Mars appeared unchanged. At 6:27, a cargo approach vector recalculated itself twice. That should not have happened. The software flagged the conflict, verified its inputs, and resolved the discrepancy internally. The approach corridor was cleared. The cargo vessel continued its descent toward the surface, unaware that its guidance confirmation had originated from a redundant system no longer synchronized with the Authority's core. At 6:33, internal access permissions began to desynchronize. The failure was subtle. Authentication tokens validated correctly, but against cached credentials rather than live authority. No single subsystem failed. Instead, systems began to diverge, each operating on an increasingly isolated interpretation of the same rules. A systems engineer paused at her station, frowning slightly as the drift became perceptible. She initiated a diagnostic handshake. The handshake did not complete. At 6:41, the Authority's external telemetry feed registered a brief power fluctuation, localized, contained, unremarkable. Internal sensors compensated. The station's rotation remained steady. Life support did not falter. Gravity held. Mars remained silent below. At 6:44, the Authority lost synchronization with its own redundancy. No alert was issued. The architecture had been designed to assume redundancy was protection. It had not accounted for the possibility that redundancy itself could be isolated, partitioned, and repurposed. The first human alarm sounded at 6:47. It was not a fire alarm or a hull breach warning. It was an administrative alert, low priority, informational, indicating that a permissions hierarchy had failed to reconcile. By the time a supervisor accessed the report, the hierarchy no longer existed in any meaningful form. Internal communications degraded rapidly. Messages arrived out of sequence. Status updates referenced subsystems that no longer responded. Attempts to reroute authority through backup consoles failed, not because systems were offline, but because they no longer agreed on who was authorized to issue commands. At 6:52, the authority attempted to contact Earth. The transmission did not complete. At 6:54, the Mars Orbital Authority issued its final automated status report. It listed all systems as nominal. 6 seconds later, an internal detonation ruptured the core coordination module. There was no external impact, no incoming object, no warning trajectory. The explosion originated within the station's own structure, propagating through compartments deliberately sealed, reinforced, and insulated against precisely this category of failure. From the surface, the station's lights flickered once. Then they went dark. In orbit, debris spread slowly, expanding into vacuum along vectors that obeyed no narrative of urgency. Mars continued its rotation beneath the wreckage, unaware of the authority that had just ceased to exist above it. On Earth, the loss would be hidden, the public none the wiser. On Mars, it would be remembered as inevitable. And in the silence that followed, between one heartbeat and the next, the balance between movement and control shifted, not through conquest or declaration, but through absence. The corridor did not close. It simply stopped answering. Chapter 1. Refit. The Mayflower arrived at Dock 9 on a schedule that had not been missed in 13 years, which in itself had become an institutional achievement worth quietly preserving. There were older ships still in service and newer hulls under construction, but none occupied the same symbolic bandwidth within the corridor as the Mayflower did, and none were treated with the same blend of procedural reverence and operational fatigue. Her arrival was logged automatically across 3 independent systems, each confirming the same data with slight variances in timestamp resolution, and then reconciled by an administrative layer designed to erase those differences before they reached human review. By the time Captain Elias Mercer's boots touched the deck plating, the ship had already been declared present, stable, and compliant by entities that did not need to see her to believe she existed. The dock itself was a product of accretion rather than design, expanded incrementally across decades of shifting mission priorities, funding cycles, and political compromises that favored continuity over elegance. Dock 9 had once been intended for experimental platforms, then retrofitted for civilian heavy transports, then partially reclassified again when the nuclear electric propulsion assemblies became normalized enough to warrant permanent infrastructure support rather than provisional containment. The result was a space that felt overbuilt in some areas and inexplicably constrained in others, with reinforced pylons rated far beyond the loads they would ever bear standing alongside narrow access corridors widened and narrowed multiple times in response to evolving safety doctrines. Everything about the dock suggested that it had been correct once, and then corrected again and again, until correctness became less important than familiarity. Mercer paused at the threshold long enough to register the shift in ambient vibration as the docking clamps engaged their final locking sequence. It was a subtle sensation, one that would have gone unnoticed by most of the technicians already moving along the gantries. But years spent inside ships whose lives depended on the difference between resonance and silence had taught him to listen with his body as much as his ears. The Mayflower settled into the dock with the practiced compliance of a vessel that had done this too many times to resist, her mass transferring into the structure in a slow, deliberate handoff that the sensors would later summarize as nominal. Nothing about the process suggested urgency, and nothing about the data would indicate that this arrival differed in any meaningful way from the last dozen. That, Mercer knew, was precisely the point. Refit cycles were where ships revealed their true relationship with the institutions that owned them. In transit, a vessel was a closed system governed by physics and crew discipline, its margins narrow and its authority hierarchy clear. In dock, however, command diffused outward into committees, subcontractors, inspectors, and optimization algorithms whose collective influence could reshape a ship more thoroughly than any single captain ever could. The Mayflower had been through enough refits that her internal geography now reflected a palimpsest of design philosophies layered atop one another, each responding to a problem that had once seemed urgent and then faded into operational background noise. Lighting systems replaced lighting systems not because the old ones failed catastrophically, but because newer studies suggested marginal improvements in circadian stability during long transfers. Water systems were rebuilt not because reclamation rates dropped below acceptable thresholds, but because unknown contaminants introduced during Mars surface operations had complicated assumptions that once seemed permanent. Even access routes shifted subtly from cycle to cycle, responding less to human ergonomics than to evolving security postures whose original justifications had been lost to archive compression. Mercer moved through the ship as these processes initiated around him, his presence acknowledged by the systems that mattered and ignored by those that did not. His command credentials propagated cleanly through the ship's internal network, granting him visibility into refit schedules, crew assignments, and inspection dependencies that would soon overlap in ways that only appeared efficient on paper. He noted the changes without commentary, cataloging them mentally the way one learned to catalog weather while at sea, aware that resistance to inevitability wasted energy better spent on preparation. The Mayflower was no longer a ship that improved through refit so much as one that survived it, emerging each cycle slightly altered, slightly heavier with redundancy, and slightly less forgiving of deviation. The refit plan itself was unremarkable in scope, which Mercer found more unsettling than if it had been ambitious. Core systems would be upgraded incrementally, not replaced, their existing architectures preserved to avoid cascading certification delays that could ripple outward into the corridor schedule. Power distribution nodes were being recalibrated to accommodate revised load profiles associated with experimental auxiliary systems whose names appeared only as placeholders in the documentation. Fuel handling assemblies were undergoing inspection and reinforcement, not because failures had been observed, but because predictive models suggested that tolerances once considered generous were no longer statistically comforting when extrapolated across another decade of continuous operation. Plumbing systems were receiving particular attention, their complexity multiplied by years of ad hoc modifications that had turned straightforward flow diagrams into interpretive exercises requiring institutional memory rather than technical skill. Mercer spent his first hours aboard not in the command ring, but in the spaces where these changes manifested most clearly. Engineering decks hummed with the sound of controlled disruption as panels were removed, reinstalled, and removed again in sequences that obeyed logic only when viewed from the correct abstraction level. Maintenance crews worked in overlapping shifts, their tasks coordinated by software that prioritized throughput over human intuition, resulting in moments where 3 teams would converge on the same junction, each responsible for a different layer of a system none of them fully owned. Mercer observed without interference, answering questions when asked and deflecting others with practiced neutrality. Captains who tried to impose coherence on refit operations tended to slow them down, and the system responded to delays by reallocating authority elsewhere. It was during one such walkthrough that Mercer encountered the first subtle indicator that this refit would not conclude as cleanly as its predecessors. The indicator did not appear as an alarm or an anomaly, but as an absence. A lighting upgrade scheduled for the habitation ring had been deferred without explanation, its allocation quietly reassigned to another project whose scope description resolved into a string of alphanumeric identifiers rather than a functional narrative. The change had been approved, signed, and archived, but no justification accompanied it, and no human name appeared alongside the authorization. Mercer flagged it mentally, aware that questions asked too early had a way of answering themselves later in less comfortable forms. The Mayflower's nuclear electric propulsion system, housed aft beyond the main habitation and cargo sections, remained untouched by the refit in any way that suggested innovation. That alone spoke volumes. Once controversial enough to require constant political defense, NEP had long since crossed the threshold into institutional normalcy, its risks reframed as manageable and its benefits rendered invisible by their reliability. The reactor assemblies were inspected according to schedule, shielding integrity verified, and control systems validated against reference baselines that had not changed in years. The electric thrusters themselves, vast in scale but modest in temperament, received routine maintenance that treated them less like engines and more like infrastructure. They were not devices one piloted so much as conditions one entered, their continuous low-thrust output shaping mission timelines in ways that encouraged patience and discouraged heroics. Mercer lingered near the propulsion boundary longer than strictly necessary, aware that this was the last place aboard where cause and effect still felt directly connected. Once the Mayflower entered the corridor under NEP acceleration, days would blur into one another, velocity accumulating invisibly while Earth receded behind layers of abstraction and delay. The ship would not leap toward Mars so much as commit to it, trading immediacy for inevitability. That trade had defined every mission cycle since the technology's adoption, and it had reshaped the psychology of everyone who served aboard. Crews learned to think in gradients rather than events, to measure progress by system stability rather than distance traveled, and to accept that by the time consequences became visible, decisions had already fossilized into history. By the time Mercer returned to the command ring, the refit had reached the stage where changes became harder to distinguish from noise. Reports flowed steadily across his console, each confirming that processes remained within acceptable parameters, each slightly less informative than the last. The ship felt full in a way it had not before, populated not just by crew and technicians, but by intent that had not yet resolved into instruction. Mercer reviewed the crew roster and noted additional support personnel assigned to assist with refit operations, their specialties broad and their deployment durations undefined. None of these violated protocols, and none of it demanded immediate response. Still, the pattern unsettled him, not because it was unprecedented, but because it was familiar in ways he could not yet articulate. It was from this vantage that Mercer observed the departure of the other ship. The vessel designated Peregrine, though its name appeared inconsistently across registries, occupied an adjacent dock, still partially encased in construction scaffolding. Officially, its departure was logged as a propulsion systems validation maneuver, a test window allocated well ahead of formal completion milestones. The justification cited administrative readiness exceeding physical readiness thresholds, language Mercer recognized as a signal rather than an explanation. He watched the telemetry feed populate as the ship disengaged from its moorings, its mass shifting free of the dock with a hesitation that read as caution rather than confidence. For a brief interval, its trajectory diverged slightly from projected bounds, the deviation small enough to fall within acceptable margins yet pronounced enough to register as discomfort. Then the system corrected. The anomaly smoothed itself into statistical insignificance, absorbed by the same administrative elasticity that allowed schedules to compress and refits to conclude without ceremony. The corridor adjusted around the Peregrine's path, not dramatically, but sufficiently to ensure that no alarms propagated beyond the local layer. Within moments, the ship was gone, its departure folded into the continuous flow of outbound traffic that defined the dock's purpose. No announcement accompanied the event, and no commentary followed. The records would show a test conducted, data collected, and conclusions pending. Mercer remained at his station long after the feed ended, aware that nothing he had witnessed could be challenged without reframing it into a narrative the system was not yet prepared to accept. He did not know then that this departure would become the axis around which the mission would later turn. He only knew that something had left before it should have, and that the dock had closed behind it without protest. The Mayflower's refit continued uninterrupted. By the second refit day, the Mayflower had entered the phase Mercer privately regarded as institutional invisibility. This was the period in which no individual system demanded attention, yet the aggregate of minor alterations began to exert a gravitational pull on the ship's identity. Reports continued to arrive on schedule, each stamped with the reassuring language of compliance, but Mercer had learned long ago that compliance was not a synonym for stability. It was an equilibrium state, one maintained through constant adjustment rather than inherent balance, and like all such states it could be preserved long past the point where its original assumptions remained valid. The crew felt the shift before it could be quantified. Routine checklists took marginally longer to complete, not because tasks had become more complex, but because interfaces had changed just enough to require reorientation. Access panels were relabeled according to updated nomenclature that aligned with new oversight standards rather than shipboard convention, forcing technicians to cross-reference documentation that existed in parallel versions, depending on which authority had last touched it. Even the ship's internal announcements adopted a subtly different cadence, their phrasing adjusted to reflect revised safety doctrines that emphasized resilience and continuity over redundancy and failure isolation. None of this disrupted operations in a measurable way, yet it altered the texture of daily life aboard, introducing a faint but persistent sense that the ship was being prepared for conditions not yet articulated. Mercer made a point of walking the habitation ring during these early cycles, not to supervise but to observe. He understood that morale aboard a long-haul vessel was less a function of comfort than of predictability, and predictability was eroded not by hardship but by unexplained change. The lighting upgrades, where they had occurred, cast a cooler, more even illumination that eliminated shadowed corners, but also flattened depth perception, subtly reshaping the way spaces were navigated. Conversations grew quieter, not because anyone had instructed restraint, but because the acoustics had shifted, dampening resonance and making voices feel exposed in ways that discouraged casual speech. These were the kinds of effects no report would capture and no committee would acknowledge, yet they accumulated in the collective awareness of the crew like pressure building beneath a sealed bulkhead. In engineering, Mercer found the most pronounced evidence of this quiet reorientation. The nuclear-electric propulsion interface, long treated as sacrosanct and largely insulated from experimental modification, had acquired a new layer of monitoring equipment whose stated purpose was optimization rather than control. Data streams once accessible only to senior engineering staff now propagated outward to administrative nodes, where they were aggregated, abstracted, and evaluated against performance models that privileged corridor throughput over ship-specific nuance. The propulsion team did not object to this expansion of oversight. Most of them welcomed it, interpreting the additional attention as validation of NEP's centrality to the interplanetary economy. Mercer, however, recognized the pattern from earlier cycles. Systems that attracted interest tended to attract dependency, and dependency had a way of transforming support into expectation. The normalization of nuclear propulsion had not occurred through a single legislative act or technological breakthrough, but through exhaustion. Public debate had withered as accident rates declined and mission success became routine, leaving behind a technology too effective to fear and too complex to interrogate meaningfully. By the time the Mayflower's reactor assemblies were considered unremarkable, the institutional machinery required to oversee them had already expanded beyond any single agency's capacity to comprehend fully. Oversight became modular, fragmented into domains that communicated through standardized interfaces rather than shared understanding. Mercer had served through this transition, watching as the language surrounding propulsion shifted from caution to inevitability, and he had learned to recognize the moment when inevitability began to demand obedience rather than consent. The refit schedule compressed subtly over the next several days, its milestones adjusted in increments small enough to escape casual notice. Inspections were reclassified as validations, validations as confirmations, confirmations as acknowledgements, each terminological shift shaving time from processes that once invited scrutiny. Mercer received these updates through the same channels as before, their tone unchanged, their authority unquestioned. He did not contest them, aware that resistance at this stage would be interpreted not as prudence, but as inefficiency. The system did not punish inefficiency overtly, it simply routed around it, reallocating authority until friction dissolved. It was during this period that Mercer requested access to the Consolidated Refit Ledger, a document rarely consulted by captains, but invaluable for tracing decision lineage. The ledger revealed a pattern he had suspected but not confirmed, an increasing proportion of modifications approved through continuity waivers rather than standard review cycles. These waivers did not bypass regulation. They reinterpreted it, invoking clauses designed for emergency conditions without formally declaring such conditions to exist. The language was precise, legally defensible, and carefully insulated from temporal specificity. No sunset provisions applied, because no emergency had been declared. The waivers existed in a liminal space, neither temporary nor permanent. Their authority derived from the assumption that continuity itself constituted a standing justification. Mercer closed the ledger with a sense of unease that had little to do with fear and much to do with recognition. He had seen this architecture before, not aboard ships, but within organizations that operated under perpetual contingency. The effect was always the same. Decision-making authority migrated upward and outward, while responsibility diffused until accountability became an exercise in historical reconstruction rather than real-time governance. Captains in such systems retained their titles and their routines, but their discretion narrowed to the management of consequences rather than causes. The Peregrine's departure remained conspicuously absent from any refit briefings or corridor updates. Its telemetry, where available, was folded into aggregate traffic analyses that obscured individual vectors beneath composite flow models. Mercer queried the data once, framing his request as a routine interest in test outcomes, and received a response that was technically complete and informationally hollow. Performance within expected parameters. Data under review. Conclusions pending. The language mirrored dozens of similar reports Mercer had signed off on throughout his career, and he understood that no further clarity would be forthcoming unless the system itself required it. By the end of the week, the Mayflower's crew roster reflected a ship preparing to depart rather than one undergoing refit. Shore rotations were curtailed, not canceled outright, but postponed indefinitely pending schedule confirmation. Training drills were consolidated, their scope broadened to encompass scenarios that extended beyond the ship's nominal mission profile. Mercer approved these changes without comment, aware that his authority to do so remained intact even as the context that gave that authority meaning shifted around him. He sensed questions forming among the senior staff, particularly his executive officer, whose familiarity with Mercer's habits made the deviations difficult to ignore. The XO did not confront him directly, choosing instead to catalog anomalies and await a moment when inquiry would be appropriate rather than merely possible. Mercer, for his part, felt the weight of an approaching inflection point without yet discerning its shape. The Mayflower had not been reassigned, nor had her mission profile been altered in any explicit way. She remained what she had always been, a vessel designed to move people and materials across a corridor that connected two worlds more symbolically than geographically. And yet, The convergence of compressed schedules, opaque authorizations, and unsignaled departures suggested that the corridor itself was becoming something more than a route. It was becoming a filter. As the refit entered its final certification phase, Mercer stood once more at the edge of the dock, watching the ship's reflection fracture across the polished surfaces of the gantry rails. The Mayflower appeared unchanged to the casual observer, her hull bearing the same scars and markings accumulated over years of service. But Mercer knew that ships did not have to change visibly to be repurposed. Sometimes all that was required was the quiet removal of alternatives, the subtle alignment of processes toward outcomes that no longer needed to be explained. The dock lights dimmed fractionally as the cycle shifted, signaling the transition from refit to readiness. The Mayflower responded as she always had, systems aligning, redundancies synchronizing, status indicators resolving into reassuring green. Mercer remained still, absorbing the moment with the practiced patience of someone who understood that departure was rarely announced by fanfare. More often, it arrived disguised as efficiency. And somewhere beyond the dock's perimeter, a ship that should not yet have been moving was already beyond recall, its absence exerting a pressure that Mercer could not yet name, but could no longer ignore. The formal transition from refit status to readiness certification occurred without ceremony, as such transitions always did. There was no announcement broadcast across the ship, no moment in which the crew was gathered to acknowledge a shift in operational posture. Instead, the change manifested through an accumulation of administrative confirmations, each minor in isolation, each definitive in aggregate. Status indicators propagated through internal systems, permissions toggled invisibly, and the Mayflower crossed a threshold that could not be pointed to on any single display, but was nonetheless absolute. She was no longer a ship being worked on. She was a ship expected to move. Mercer felt the distinction most acutely in the language of requests that began to reach his console. Where earlier communications had asked for acknowledgement, they now assumed consent. Maintenance teams no longer proposed timelines, they notified him of completions. Engineering reports shifted from exploratory diagnostics to performance affirmations, their phrasing calibrated to signal reliability rather than inquiry. Even external correspondence adopted a tone of inevitability, referencing upcoming milestones as though they were already historical facts awaiting formal recording. The system did not rush him, but it did not leave him room to pause. The Mayflower's command ring became the locus of this transformation. Displays that once presented layered system data with adjustable granularity now defaulted to summary states optimized for decision endorsement rather than analysis. Mercer could still access deeper strata if he wished, but doing so required deliberate navigation through menus designed to discourage prolonged engagement. This was not accidental. It reflected an institutional confidence that captains did not need to understand every variable so long as outcomes remained within acceptable bounds. Mercer had served long enough to know that acceptable bounds were rarely fixed. They expanded or contracted in response to pressure, and the pressure was mounting. Crew movement patterns adjusted accordingly. Personnel who had lingered near their workspaces during refit now adhered more strictly to assigned rotations, their schedules synchronized to minimize overlap and idle time. The ship grew quieter, not through silence, but through efficiency. Conversations became purposeful, stripped of digression. The corridors, once sites of informal exchange, assumed the character of transit pathways rather than communal spaces. Mercer recognized this behavioral compression as a precursor to departure, but he also noted its premature arrival. The crew was behaving as though the corridor already lay ahead of them. In the habitation modules, colonist replacements began to arrive in small groups, their presence noted but not emphasized. They were civilians by designation, selected through processes that blended lottery mechanics with aptitude screening. and they carried with them the subdued demeanor of individuals who understood that their futures were being negotiated by systems they could neither see nor influence. Mercer observed them from a distance, mindful of the fact that he would likely never know their names beyond what appeared on manifests. In earlier cycles, captains had made a point of addressing colonist cohorts directly, offering reassurance and framing the journey ahead. This time, no such expectation surfaced. The ship's informational systems handled orientation, delivering standardized briefings that emphasized safety, routine, and the statistical improbability of incident. Human presence was no longer required to convey confidence. The nuclear propulsion section remained physically isolated, as it always had, but its conceptual isolation had eroded. Access protocols now permitted remote oversight from continuity nodes that existed beyond the ship's command hierarchy. Their authority, derived from cross-agency compacts Mercer had never seen formalized. The reactor's performance metrics streamed outward continuously, feeding models that predicted corridor efficiency at scales far larger than any single vessel. Mercer was aware that this integration was celebrated as progress, a triumph of coordination over fragmentation. Yet, he could not escape the sense that the Mayflower's value was being recalculated not in terms of mission success, but in terms of throughput contribution. He requested a briefing from the chief engineer under the pretext of final familiarization, framing his questions around recent upgrades and their implications for long-term maintenance. The engineer responded confidently, even enthusiastically, outlining improvements in power distribution stability and fault tolerance. When Mercer probed further, asking how these changes altered the ship's operational envelope, the answers grew more abstract. Capabilities had increased, margins had widened, resilience had improved. Specific scenarios were not discussed. The engineer did not resist the inquiry, but neither did he illuminate it. Mercer realized that even those closest to the systems no longer framed their work in terms of contingency. They trusted the architecture to absorb deviation without human intervention. This trust extended to the administrative layer overseeing the refit's conclusion. Certification documents arrived pre-populated, their fields already filled with values awaiting Mercer's digital signature. He reviewed them carefully, noting that each attestation referenced standards that had been updated within the last cycle, their revisions justified by evolving best practices rather than identified deficiencies. The cumulative effect was a regulatory environment that advanced continuously without acknowledging the displacement it caused. Mercer signed where required, aware that refusal would trigger escalation mechanisms whose outcomes were predictable and whose delays would be attributed to him personally. The absence of the peregrine continued to register as a negative space within this accelerating context. No one mentioned her departure aloud, yet subtle accommodations hinted at its significance. Corridor simulations adjusted load distributions, compensating for a missing mass that should have been present. Supply forecasts incorporated contingencies that implied an awareness of delayed or diverted assets. These adjustments were made quietly, without annotation, as though the system had accepted the peregrine's absence as a parameter rather than a problem. Mercer understood then that whatever had occurred was no longer under investigation. It had been subsumed. His executive officer approached him late in the cycle, choosing a moment when operational demands were minimal and privacy could be plausibly maintained. The XO did not accuse or speculate. She presented observations, carefully framed as requests for clarification. Crew additions without customary briefings. Training drills expanded beyond declared mission scope. Shore leave curtailed earlier than precedent suggested. Mercer listened without interruption, recognizing in her tone the discipline of someone who knew how to ask questions that did not require immediate answers. He responded with reassurances calibrated to maintain trust without disclosing uncertainty, emphasizing corridor dynamics and the necessity of flexibility. The XO accepted this, but Mercer saw the calculation behind her nod. She was cataloging anomalies, not dismissing them. As the final refit systems powered down and the ship transitioned fully to pre-departure configuration, Mercer found himself reflecting on the Mayflower's history in a way he had not during previous cycles. She had been conceived as a solution to a specific problem: how to move large populations and their material dependencies across interplanetary distances without militarizing the corridor. Over time, that solution had become infrastructure, and infrastructure had become assumption. The ship's class designation, never publicly clarified, its specifications deliberately opaque, reflected this evolution. The Mayflower was no longer experimental, but neither was she standardized. She occupied a category of her own, justified by precedent rather than specification. Normalization had been her greatest triumph and her most significant risk. By functioning reliably, she had rendered herself indispensable. By becoming indispensable, she had invited forms of control that did not require explicit assertion. Mercer understood that the corridor depended on the Mayflower, but he also recognized the inversion taking place. The Mayflower was beginning to depend on the corridor, not merely as a route, but as a governing logic that defined her purpose. On the eve of readiness confirmation, Mercer stood alone on the external observation platform, gazing at the ship from a vantage point that allowed her full profile to emerge against the void. Dock structures framed her hull, their geometries precise, temporary. The ship herself appeared immutable by comparison, a constant amid the machinery that serviced her. Mercer knew better. Ships endured only so long as they aligned with the systems that sustained them. Misalignment did not always result in destruction. More often, it resulted in reassignment. He returned to the command ring as the final readiness signal propagated through the network, its confirmation echoed by a cascade of acknowledgments from oversight bodies whose names blurred together in his memory. The Mayflower was cleared. Not to depart, no such directive had yet been issued, but to exist in a state of perpetual imminence. Mercer accepted this status with the outward composure expected of him, even as he sensed that imminence, once established, rarely receded. Beyond the dock, the corridor waited, not as a destination, but as an organizing principle that had begun to assert itself long before the first engine burn. The final phase of readiness unfolded in a manner so procedural that it bordered on abstraction. By the time the Mayflower's status officially transitioned from refit complete to corridor eligible, the distinction had already lost practical meaning. Systems had been aligned, redundancies synchronized, and authority pathways clarified well in advance of any formal declaration. What remained was not preparation, but confirmation, a retrospective acknowledgement that the ship had been moving toward departure for some time, even while physically anchored. Mercer's role during this interval became increasingly ceremonial, though no one would have described it as such. He continued to review manifests, authorize system handoffs, and sign compliance attestations, yet each action felt less like a decision and more like an affirmation of momentum. The documents presented to him no longer framed alternatives. They described conditions as fixed and required his endorsement to preserve continuity rather than to enable choice. This was not coercion in any explicit sense. It was alignment, achieved through the quiet removal of divergence. The ship's internal governance reflected this shift with unsettling fidelity. Department heads adjusted their reporting structures without instruction, routing updates through newly emphasized continuity channels rather than traditional command hierarchies. Requests for clarification diminished, replaced by assumptions that guidance would arrive embedded within system updates rather than through conversation. Mercer observed this adaptation with professional detachment, recognizing it as the natural response of competent personnel operating within an environment that rewarded anticipation over inquiry. The crew was not being silenced, They were being trained to listen differently. Colonist processing accelerated during this period, their intake synchronized with the ship's readiness posture. The individuals selected to replace outgoing Mars residents arrived in staggered intervals, their documentation pristine, their profiles optimized for integration. Mercer noted the absence of personal effects beyond prescribed allowances, a detail that suggested institutional curation rather than individual choice. These were not settlers carrying fragments of former lives. They were variables inserted into a system calibrated for balance. The ship's orientation briefings emphasized routine, safety, and statistical reliability, framing the journey as a continuation of established patterns rather than a transition into uncertainty. Mercer understood the necessity of this framing, even as he recognized its cost. The corridor did not tolerate narratives that invited deviation. The nuclear electric propulsion systems entered standby readiness without incident, their reactors humming at baseline output as diagnostic cycles completed. The engineering teams reported performance metrics that exceeded expectations, citing recent upgrades as evidence of the ship's evolving resilience. Mercer acknowledged these reports, though he could not ignore the irony implicit in their phrasing. Resilience, once a hedge against failure, had become a justification for increased demand. The more capable the Mayflower became, the more indispensable she was perceived to be, and indispensability carried obligations that were rarely articulated until they were unavoidable. External communications from PNFC increased in frequency, but decreased in specificity. Messages arrived framed as informational bulletins rather than directives, their content focused on corridor health, throughput optimization, and macro-level stability indicators. Nowhere did they mention the peregrine, nor did they address the adjustments rippling outward from her absence. Mercer recognized this silence as intentional. The system had already absorbed the anomaly, and anomalies that could be absorbed did not merit further attention. Inquiry would only reintroduce friction. The executive officer approached Mercer once more, this time under the guise of final coordination. Her questions were practical, centered on crew readiness and morale indicators, yet beneath them lay an unspoken concern that Mercer did not attempt to dispel. He responded with measured reassurance, emphasizing that variability was inherent to corridor operations and that adaptability was a core competency of the Mayflower's crew. The XO accepted this explanation with professional grace, but Mercer sensed the boundary they had reached. Trust remained intact, yet it now rested on faith in Mercer rather than transparency of process. He understood the burden this placed on him and accepted it as part of the role he had been assigned, whether explicitly or by omission. As the dock systems disengaged incrementally, power feeds decoupled, environmental controls transitioned to shipboard autonomy, the Mayflower assumed a posture that was neither stationary nor in motion. She hovered in a liminal state, physically restrained yet operationally committed. Mercer stood in the command ring, observing the slow choreography of separation that would culminate in departure without fanfare. There would be no countdown audible beyond the ship, no broadcast announcement to mark the moment. The corridor did not require spectacle to function. In the final hours before undocking, Mercer reviewed the ship's operational history, tracing the arc of her service through successive cycles. He noted the gradual compression of timelines, the expansion of oversight, the normalization of exceptional measures. Each iteration had been justified, each adjustment defensible within its context. Together, they formed a trajectory that was difficult to challenge precisely because it had never been declared. The Mayflower had become what the system required her to be through a series of small, rational steps, none of which could be isolated as the moment where choice was lost. When the final clearance signal arrived, it did so as a status update rather than an order. The Mayflower systems acknowledged it automatically, initiating departure protocols that Mercer confirmed with a single gesture. The ship responded smoothly, her mass shifting as restraints released and thrusters adjusted to compensate for newfound freedom. Earth's curvature filled the forward displays, serene and indifferent, as the dock structures receded. Mercer felt no surge of triumph or dread, only a steady awareness that the corridor ahead represented more than distance. It was an architecture of expectation, a mechanism that sorted actions and outcomes according to priorities that no longer required explanation. As the Mayflower eased away from the dock, he understood that her journey had begun long before this moment, shaped by decisions made elsewhere, recorded after the fact, and justified in the language of continuity. The ship entered free space without resistance, her trajectory aligning seamlessly with corridor parameters that had already accounted for her passage. Behind her, the dock returned to readiness for the next vessel, its systems resetting as though nothing had changed. Ahead lay the vast, ordered emptiness between worlds, a space defined not by absence, but by the structures imposed upon it. Mercer remained at his station as the Mayflower accelerated gently, the first increments of distance registering as data points rather than sensations. He knew that whatever awaited them beyond the corridor would be interpreted through the same frameworks that had brought them here. The ship would move, the system would adapt, and continuity would be preserved. Whether anything else would survive that preservation remained an open question, one that would not be asked until it was too late to answer.